This time it's been a short, sharp strike, but it's already had a knock-on effect. There are empty beds up on Bland Sutton Ward because the hospital stopped all but emergency admissions last Thursday.
Great Britain 1979, the winter of discontent, Scottish devolution, Margaret Thatcher. But amongst all the doom and gloom of the late 1970s came a new British music scene in a band that perfectly captured the moment. This is the story of the album that changed my life. This is the story of The Specials. Hello, my name is Richard, and this is the first in a brand new series called Albums That Changed My Life. In this episode, we're going back to the late 1970s and a time of much political change in the United Kingdom as Margaret Thatcher became the UK's first female Prime Minister. This was not seen as a positive by many, but my father, until then, who'd been a staunch Labour voter, certainly saw something in her as he soon became a big fan of the Iron Lady. As for me, well, I was just 10 years old at the time. I turned 11 that summer, so it would take me a few years to really understand the significance of these two events. Despite all the rather negative political stuff, 1979 was not all bad. For a start, Thorpe Park opened. The Vauxhall Astra was released. The first Jubilee Line train was put into service. And, importantly, the first Wetherspoons pub opened in North London. In sport, we saw the first £1 million footballer. Liverpool won the league title yet again. Arsenal beat Manchester United in what became known as the 5-minute FA Cup final. And Brian Clough's Nottingham Forest won the European Cup thanks to a goal from that £1 million man. Elsewhere, Bjorn Borg and Martina Navratilova won Wimbledon, while Sebastian Coe set a new world record in the mile of 3 minutes 48 seconds. On TV, Minder aired for the first time, along with Tales of the Unexpected, Question Time, and Not the 9 O'Clock News. The big films of the year were Alien, Monty Python's Life of Brian, and Quadrophenia. While in literature, we saw the release of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, while the first issue of Viz hit the shops. It was also a great year for music with the release of The Clash's seminal album, London Calling, and of course the birth of the Two-Tone record label. Now, back in the spring of 1979, I'd first heard a song from a new band on that particular label, which immediately captivated me. Although I was still very young at the time, still in my final year of primary school, I was fortunate enough to have an older sister with a record player, and she had already introduced me to the punk new wave sounds of The Jam and the reggae tinged rock of The Police, both of whom remain firm favourites of mine to this day. And for me, that single, Gangsters by The Specials, was a mix of the two, and I instantly fell in love with it. Now, 1979 was a significant year for me, as that autumn I started secondary school, and around that time, The Specials' debut album was released, imaginatively titled The Specials. It marked the start of the British ska revival, with Madness and The Selector also flying the flag for the Coventry-based Two-Tone Records. Then my sister, she really loved Madness, and that October she proudly brought home their debut album, One Step Beyond. Now, while I also loved that album, I was only really interested in the more edgy sound of The Specials. So when their album was also released later that same month, I managed to convince my sister to buy it with her earnings from her new Saturday job. And what a purchase it turned out to be. Of course, at that time, I was too young to really understand the political nature of the lyrics on subjects such as racism.
Just because you're a black boy, just because you're a white, it doesn't mean you've got to hate him. It doesn't mean you've got to fight.
Teenage pregnancy.
You've done too much too young. Now you're married with a kid when you could be having fun with me.
Inner city crime.
Concrete jungle, animals after me. A concrete jungle, dancing on the streets. Concrete jungle, glad I got my mates with me.
And teenage suicide.
Then you went your bed, and I think that's sad. For the girl of 19, it's more than sad. It's obscene.
I just loved the energy and the music. Right from the start, I couldn't get enough of tracks like Do the Dog.
Oh, you punks and all you tits. National front and anti-threats. Most of the sickness and skinheads. Keep on fighting till you're dead.
Nightclub.
It's a silly place to be. What am I doing here? Watching the girls go by, spending money.
The dawning of a new era.
It's the dawning of a new era. It's the dawning of a new era. I met a girl from Marion Queen. She told me that she worked in a chicken factory.
And possibly my favourite one on the album, Blank Expression.
Where did you get that blank expression on your face? Where did you get that blank expression on your face?
In fact, listening to any of those tracks now, and they still sound fresh and exciting, and they take me back to those great early days at Britain's secondary school. Of course, the album was heavily influenced by Jamaican ska of the 1960s, with cover versions of Too Hot, Monkey Man, and the first single released from the album, A Message to You, Rudy, featuring, of course, the sax mastery of ska legend Rico Rodriguez. But in truth, this was more of a punk rock album. Produced by Elvis Costello, it had brilliantly edgy guitar riffs throughout, which seemed to fit effortlessly amongst the ska beats. And then, of course, we had the lyrics, which perfectly captured the disenchantment of youth in the UK in the late 1970s. Although many of the songs were written about their hometown of Coventry, a city which was suffering more than most, they also rang true about pretty much anywhere at that time, and now, to be fair. For me, living in a largely middle-class commuter belt on the Essex-East London border, they certainly didn't sum up my life at that time, but it didn't make them any less powerful. And as I grew up, I began to understand much more about where Terry Hall and Jerry Damners had been coming from. In fact, by the mid-1980s, those lyrics pretty much summed up my life as a teenager in an area that was beginning to suffer its own issues of racism, crime, and, in my case, teenage pregnancy, as I had my first child when I was just 19. It would be far too poetic to suggest that I actually lived my teenage years through the lyrics of this album, but it certainly seemed that way for a while. You see, music is not just something that you hear on the radio, it really does change your life, and this album certainly changed mine. It made me become much more politically aware, more angry perhaps, as disenchanted as Terry had been back in 1979, but also more at ease with myself and what I wanted to be. And it really left my turntable for the next 10 years. I still recall those days in the early 1980s sitting in my sister's room while she played the latest from Duran Duran or Adam and the Ants, begging her to put on the specials one more time, and then sneaking into her room when she was out so I could play it all over again. Sadly, my sister Karen died in 1993, aged just 28. So while 1979 was not a vintage year for the UK as a whole, it certainly was vital in shaping my life. Thatcher and the Specials' debut album, You Both, have an awful lot to answer for. My name is Richard, and this has been the first in a new series of albums that changed my life. If you have enjoyed this episode, please give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel. I'll be back next time with another album that changed my life, but what will that album be? You just have to stay tuned to find out.